quarantine history. Yesterday we talked about the Cherokees and how they had assimilated and attempted to do everything they'd been asked to keep their land, even as far as taking their case to the Supreme Court of the United States and winning. The United States government and the Supreme Court essentially says that Georgia has no power over them whatsoever, that they are sovereign, and the actions of the state of Georgia encroaching on Cherokee land and trying to take it is completely illegal. And Andrew Jackson is the executive of the United States. He's pushed for this Indian removal, and Andrew Jackson, for the most part, just ignores the Supreme Court of the United States, which is unheard of. And so ultimately in the end, they'll be moved to Oklahoma, just like the Chickasaws, the Creeks, and the Choctaws before them. And so today I have a reading for you. You will find this at the bottom of your notes. And so if you go to your Expanding Nation Part 1 notes that are in the Expanding Nation forward and go all the way to the end, you'll find them. They're right there past the Meriwether Lewis story from the last days of his life. And it's titled John G. Burnett's Story of the Removal of the Cherokees. And so if you take a second, pause this video and pull that up. I'm going to try to post this on the screen for you too to follow along. And then I'm going to add 2 or 3 questions just for another real easy grade for you at the end. But I'm going to read this to you. This is a story of someone who was there with the Cherokees, witnessed the suffering, and this is a pretty good example of what the trip was like. And so I read this every year in class, and I'm going to read it to you today. Like I said, when it gets to that point, I'm just going to put it up on the screen for you. So here you go. It says, "Children, this is my birthday, December 11th, 1890. I am 80 years old today. I was born at King Iron Works in Sullivan County, Tennessee, December 11th, 1810. I grew into manhood fishing in Beaver Creek and roaming through the forest, hunting the deer and the wild boar and the timber wolf. I often spent weeks at a time in the solitary wilderness with no companions but my rifle, hunting knife, and a small hatchet that I'd carried in my belt in all of my wilderness wanderings. On these long hunting trips, I met and became acquainted with many of the Cherokee Indians, hunting with them by day and sleeping around their campfires by night. I learned to speak their language, and they taught me the arts of trailing and building traps and snares. On one of my long hunts in the fall of 1829, I found a young Cherokee who had been shot by a roving band of hunters and who had eluded his pursuers and concealed himself under a shelving rock. Weak from loss of blood, the poor creature was unable to walk and almost famished for water. I carried him to a spring, bathed and bandaged the bullet wound, and built a shelter out of bark peeled from a dead chestnut tree. I nursed and protected him, feeding him on chestnuts and roasted deer meat. When he was able to travel, I accompanied him to the home of his people and remained so long I was given up for lost. By the time I had become an expert rifleman, a fairly good archer, and a good trapper, and spent most of my time in the forest in quest of game." Give me a second, I'm going to tell my son to stop bouncing the basketball. Sorry. The removal of the Cherokee Indians from their lifelong homes in the year 1838 found me a young man in the prime of my life and a private soldier in the American Army. Being acquainted with many of the Indians and able to fluently speak their language, I was sent as an interpreter into the Smoky Mountain country in May of 1838 and witnessed the execution of the most brutal order in the history of American warfare. I saw the helpless Cherokees arrested and dragged from their homes and driven by the bayonet point into the stockades. And in the chilling drizzle in the chill of a drizzling rain on an October morning, I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep into 645 wagons and started towards the west. And so one of the things we talked about yesterday, they just showed up, they grabbed these people, At gunpoint, they forced them out of their homes, and they took them to fields that were surrounded by fences, and they sat on there. They sat in the open for 6 months, and a lot of people died, especially the old and the young, exposed to the elements that long. You can imagine yourself sitting out in a field for 6 months, from May, from next month until October, to almost Halloween, and the only thing you have is what you grabbed in the 5 minutes before you were dragged out of your house and into the open. One can never forget the sadness and solemnity of that morning. Chief John Ross led in prayer, and when the bugle sounded and the wagon started rolling, many of the children rose to their feet and waved their little hands goodbye to their mountain homes, knowing they were leaving them forever. Many of these helpless people did not have blankets, and many of them had been driven from their homes barefoot. On the morning of November the 17th, we encountered a terrific sleet and snowstorm with freezing temperatures. And from that day until we reached the end of the journey on March the 26th, 5 months, 1839, the suffering of the Cherokee were awful. The trail of the exiles was a trail of death. They had to sleep in the wagons and on the ground without fire. And I had known as many as 22 of them to die in one night of pneumonia due to ill treatment, cold, and exposure. Among this number was the beautiful Christian wife of Chief John Ross. This noble-hearted woman died a martyr to childhood, giving her only blanket for the protection of a sick child. She rode thinly clad through a blinding sleet and snowstorm, developing pneumonia, and died in the still hours of a bleak winter night, with her head resting on Lieutenant Gregg's saddle blanket. I made the long journey to the west with the Cherokees and did all that a private soldier could do to alleviate their suffering. When on guard duty at night, I had many times walked my beat in my blouse in order that some sick child might have the warmth of my overcoat. I was on guard duty the night Mrs. Ross died. When relieved at midnight, I did not retire, but remained around the wagon out of sympathy for Chief Ross, and at daylight was detailed by Captain McClellan to assist in the burial like the other unfortunates who died on the way. Her unconfined body was buried in a shallow grave by the roadside, far from her native home, and the sorrowing cavalcade moved on. Being a young man, I mingled freely with the young women and girls, and had spent many pleasant hours with them when I was supposed to be under my blanket, and they had many times sung their mountain songs for me, this being all they could do to repay my kindness. And with all my association with Indian girls from October 1829 to March 26, 1839, I did not meet one who was a moral prostitute. They are kind and tender-hearted, and many of them were beautiful. The only trouble that I had with anybody on the entire journey to the west was a brutal teamster by the name of Ben McDonald, who was using his whip on an old feeble Cherokee to hasten him into the wagons. The sight of that old and nearly blind creature quivering under the lashes of a bullwhip was too much for me. I attempted to stop McDonald, and it ended in a personal encounter. He lashed me across the face, the wire tip of his whip cutting a deep gash in my cheek. The little hatchet that I'd carried in my hunting days was in my belt, and McDonald was carried unconscious from the scene. I was placed under guard by Ensign Henry Bullock and Private Eleanor Millard. I was placed under guard, but Ensign Henry Bullock and Private Eleanor Millard had both witnessed the encounter. They gave Captain McClellan the facts, and I was never brought to trial. Years later, I met Second Lieutenant Riley and Ensign Bullock at Bristol at John Robertson's show, and Bullock jokingly reminded me that there was a case still pending against me for a court-martial and wanted to know how much longer I was going to have the trial put off. McDonald finally recovered, and in the year 1851 was running a boat out of Memphis, Tennessee. The long painful journey to the west ended on March 26, 1839, with 4,000 silent graves reaching from the foothills of the Smoky Mountains to what is known as Indian Territory in the west. And covetousness, greed on the part of the white race was the cause of all the Cherokees had to suffer. Ever since Ferdinand de Soto made his journey through Indian country in the year 1540, there had been a tradition of a rich gold mine somewhere in the Smoky Mountain country. And I think the tradition was true. At a festival at Chawda on Christmas night in 1829, I danced and played with Indian girls who were wearing ornaments around their necks that looked like gold. In the year 1828, a little Indian boy living on Ward Creek had sold a gold nugget to a white trader, and that nugget sealed the doom of the Cherokees. In a short time, the country was overrun with armed brigands claiming to be government agents who paid no attention to the rights of the Indians, who were the legal possessors of the country. Crimes were committed that were a disgrace to civilization. Men were shot in cold blood, lands were confiscated. Homes were burned and the inhabitants were driven out by the gold-hungry brigands. Chief Junaluska was personally acquainted with President Andrew Jackson. Junaluska had taken 500 of the flower of the Cherokee Scouts and helped Jackson win the Battle of the Horseshoe, which is when he defeated the Creeks, leaving 33 of them dead on the field. And in that battle, Junaluska had drove his tomahawk through the skull of a Creek warrior when the Creek had Jackson at his mercy. Chief John Ross sent Junaluska as an envoy to plead with President Jackson, for protection for his people. But Jackson's manner was cold and indifferent toward the rugged son of the forest who had saved his life. He met Junaluska, heard his plea, but curtly said, "Sir, your audience is ended. There is nothing I can do for you." The doom of the Cherokee was sealed. Washington, D.C. had decreed that they must be driven west and their lands given to the white men. In May of 1838, an army of 4,000 regulars and 3,000 volunteer soldiers under command of General Winfield Scott marched into Indian country and wrote the bleakest chapter on the pages of American history. Men working in the fields were arrested and driven from the stockades. Women were dragged from their homes by soldiers whose language they could not understand. Children were often separated from their parents and driven into the stockades with a blue sky for a blanket and earth for a pillow. And often the old and infirm were prodded with bayonets to hasten them to the stockades. In one home, death came during the night. A little sad-faced child had died and was lying on a bearskin couch, and some women were preparing the little body for burial. All were arrested and driven out, leaving the children in the cabin. I don't know who buried the body. In another home was a frail mother, apparently a widow, and 3 small children, one just a baby. When told that she must go, the mother gathered her children at her feet, prayed a humble prayer in her native tongue, patted the old family doll on the head, and told the faithful creature goodbye. With the baby strapped on her back and leading a child with each hand, started on her exile. But that task was too great for that frail mother. A stroke of heart failure relieved her suffering, and she sunk and died with her baby on her back, while her other 2 children clinging to her hands. Chief Junaluska, who had saved President Jackson's life at the Battle of Horseshoe, witnessed this scene, the tears gushing down his cheeks and lifting his cap. He turned his face towards the heavens and said, "Oh my God, if I had known at the Battle of Horseshoe what I know now, American history would be differently written." I'll be right back once I smack this rabbit. Sorry. At this time in 1890, we are too near the removal of the Cherokees for our young people to fully understand the enormity of the crime that was committed against the helpless race. Truth is, the facts are being concealed from the young people of today. School children of today do not know that we are living on lands that were taken from the helpless race at bayonet point to satisfy the white man's greed. Future generations will read and condemn the act, and I do hope posterity will remember that private soldiers like myself, and like the 4 Cherokees who were forced by General Scott to shoot an Indian chief and his children, had to execute orders of their superiors. We had no choice in the matter. 25 years after the removal, it was my privilege to meet a large company of the Cherokees in uniform of the Confederate Army under command of Colonel Thomas. They were encamped at Zollenkoffer, and I went to see them. Most of them were just boys at the time of the removal, but they instantly recognized me as the soldier that was good to us. Being able to talk to them in their native language, I had an enjoyable day with them. From them I learned that Chief John Ross was still ruler in the nation in 1863, and I wonder if he is still living. He was a noble-hearted fellow and suffered a lot for his race. At one time, he was arrested and thrown into a dirty jail in an effort to break his spirit, but he remained true to his people and led them in prayer when they started on their exile. And his Christian wife sacrificed her life for a little girl who had pneumonia. The Anglo-Saxon race would build a towering monument to perpetuate her noble act in giving her only blanket for comfort of a sick child. Incidentally, the child recovered, but Miss Ross is sleeping in an unmarked grave far from her native Smoky Mountain home. When Scott invaded Indian country, some of the Cherokees fled to caves and dens in the mountains and were never captured, and there they are today. I have long intended going there and trying to find them, but I have put off going from year to year, and now I am too feeble to ride that far. The fleeting years have come and gone, and old age has overtaken me. I can truthfully say that neither my rifle nor my knife were stained with Cherokee blood. I can truthfully say that I did my best for them when they certainly did need a friend. 25 years after the removal, I still lived in their memories as the soldier that was good to us. However, murder is murder, whether committed by a villain skulking in the dark or by uniformed men stepping to the strains of martial music. Murder is murder, and somebody must answer. Somebody must explain the streams of blood that flowed into Indian country in the summer of 1838. Somebody must explain the 4,000 silent graves that mark the trail of the Cherokee to their exile. I wish I could forget it all, but the picture of the 645 wagons lumbering over the frozen ground with their cargo of suffering humanity still lingers in my memory. Let the historians of a future day tell the sad story with its sights, its tears, and its dying groans. Let the great judge of all the earth weigh our actions and reward us according to our work. Children, thus ends my promised birthday story this December the 11th, 1890. All right, that's it. I'm going to post maybe 2 questions up there. You'll find those inside the Expanding Nation folder that is inside the Quarantine History folder. Hope you enjoyed it. It gives a little bit insight to exactly what happened from somebody else's perspective who was there. It's another one of those cases of, a sad thing that happens to the American Indians. One of the things that in American history is probably something that, those rabbits, probably something we regret. I'm going to go punch a rabbit. Yeah, I'm going to go punch a rabbit. I'll see you tomorrow. I got another reading for you tomorrow that we're going to do, and then I think we got a little bit of a break when it happens. So, see you tomorrow.